What's going to happen?
Something wonderful.
The perfect world was a dream between primitive cerebral.
He's a traitor! He's a sadist!
You're all going to die down here.
The greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist.
Happy heresies and welcome to the desert of the real. Welcome with kindness and love to AM Gnostic Radio, broadcast from the virtual Alexandria, that state of mind where East meets West, always through the skookum God above God dat cam. We don't take prisoners but liberate them. We are not the final authority on anything, but hope to be an endless possibility for everything, including unleashing that Pandora box of wonders that is your restless heart, finding that mystery that works for you and only you. A man once asked H.P. Blavatsky if he had a divine spark. She answered, "Yes, and I can even hear it snoring." No more snoring as you're waking up to this world of illusion and delusion and allusion to what you once were. Some things are better left unsaid, but you can bet your sweet ass they're gonna be said here anyway.
You're going to have to learn how you can go through a looking glass into another kind of perception where you have that sense of being united to all things, and suddenly you understand everything.
I am Abraxas, that terrible god above God as the ancients knew him, in his meat space incarnation of Miguel Connor, broadcasting from the lawful but frigid dystopia of Chicago, patiently waiting for the beginning of the world. I am your Pompatus of Gnosis, and you are mine because of your wonderful feedback and company. Divided we stand, together we rise. We're running with those searching for the truth and avoiding those who have found it. We're writing our own gospel and living our own myth.
You're just this person. You're like this island unto yourself.
I can't enjoy anything unless everybody is. If one guy is starving someplace, that's, I puts a crimp in my evening.
Oddly, or perhaps not so oddly, Joni Mitchell described our sacred and profane quest when she said in her song Woodstock, "We are stardust, billion-year-old carbon. We are golden, caught in the devil's bargain. And we've got to get ourselves back to the garden." Ready to get back to the garden? Are you ready to get higher? Especially on this early January, the year of our demiurge 2018. Things are only going to get weirder as the archons ramp up their oppression of consciousness. Thus, I continue to bring you the content that liberates you, especially after a wacky 2017. Are you ready to get higher on our first episode of the year? Like an Icarus with his wings not bound by wax, but by the very substance of creativity and invention and loving compassion.
By the power of truth, I, while living, have conquered the universe.
So let's talk about entheogens, or drugs, or psychedelics, or whatever you want to call them. Let's discuss ayahuasca and other spiritual substances in an ancient and modern context. For this, we have the infernal pleasure of having as our astral guest Danny Nemu, who materializes at the virtual Alexandria to discuss his new book, Neuro-Apocalypse. Fascinating book and fascinating interview, where the good Reverend will cover so much on psychedelics, as well as some incredible psychological and neuroscientific insights on the Torah. Hint, hint, they knew how to party. And so much more. And I even open up about my days of employing ayahuasca with a Christian mystic group from the Amazons. Even if these days I'm in the program. For more on Danny, who might be one of the most interesting and kindsome figures you'll ever meet, please visit nemusend.co.uk or look at our show notes.
Where'd you go to weed college?
Did the Gnostics employ psychedelics? I'm asked that a lot. I would recommend our interviews with Chris Bennett, which you can find at our YouTube channels or our members section. This Canadian cannabis count has done mucho great research on it. As for me, the most obvious example is Marcus the Magician. In the 2nd century, this Gnostic sage believed that one had to experience the divine and created a special Eucharist that would send his followers into ecstatic states.
We are not of one mind, but we now speak with one voice.
In the ritual, individuals took turns as the priests, showing the Gnostic egalitarian attitude. According to the church father Hippolytus, the wine bubbled and was effervescent, and changed color right before everyone's eyes. And it quickly altered the consciousness of Marcus's coven, calling it that because they were mostly women.
Are there any women here today?
In the mystic ceremony, and according to Marcus, the quote, blood wine summoned a mighty angel that possessed the congregation and brought them all into the mysteries of the bridal chamber. That place of oneness and individuation where they commune with the pleroma.
It's like God's vagina.
Some scholars have said the wine was the same kykeon employed by the Hellenistic mystery religions. That's a main evidence for ya. How you choose to employ or weaponize entheogens in your life is your business. But we hope that this absorbing interview with Danny Nemu offers you more choices in a world that is losing all choices because of the censorship of Jehovah and his angelic Puritans.
Those pious morons are too busy talking to their phony baloney God.
Maybe Yaldabaoth isn't about oppression though, but just wanton narcissism, as he's depicted in the movie Mother. In the film, Yahweh says that he cares for humans, but it's clearly that what he actually cares about is their adulation.
How shall we fuck off, O Lord?
We mortals inspire and sustain him with our divine spark, as does the Sophia character in the film, played by Jennifer Lawrence. But that's all so he can continue to shape false realities that make him look good. Serve his core essence of mimicking the supreme reality of the pleroma. He expects our unconditional love for his conditional bad experiences in art. I'm sure you've dated people like that.
What's God? Well, you know, when you want something really bad and you close your eyes and you wish for it, God's the guy that ignores you.
Or maybe the demiurge is just the twisted image of our view of the divine. Maybe both. But enough of my drivel. Let's get high and let us to our first part of our interview with Danny Nemu.
I've seen every shooting star since the first one. Every flash of lightning. I've heard the last gasp of each thing that ever lived. Nothing's interesting anymore. Nothing surprises you. Not a thing. The repetitiveness. The obstinate, dull repetitiveness of your father's plan is bewildering to me. The same lives lived over and over and over and over again. Is there a plan? It all has to turn into something. It has to pour out into something. But into what? And that's my weakness. Curiosity. I'll stay as long as it takes, forever, to witness the end. The final sunset, if there is one. Maybe on that day, late in the afternoon, seconds away, he'll want to start it all over again. From the beginning. He's done it before. Recreated the whole thing, retold the whole thing, on a whim, with little differences that must mean the world to him. A branch that crooks in a different direction, one egg more or less than the nest of a flea. What a self-centered, self-indulgent creature he is, isn't he? Deaf, mute, insatiable.
This is the AM Bite interview, and with us we definitely have the pleasure of being joined by Danny Nemu to discuss his book, Neuro-Apocalypse and Other Sundries. How you doing today, Danny?
I'm very well, thank you, Miguel. How's it going?
It's going well. Again, thanks for joining us. So as I like to ask, I like to go in the beginning. Tell us a little bit about your journey, your spiritual hitchhiking, and how you got here where we are today.
Ooh, where do we begin? I grew up. I was born 41 years ago into a Reformed Jewish family, and there's not a whole lot of spirit in that kind of vibe, or certainly there wasn't really in the way my family did it. And I guess for most of my kind of teens, I would have been a rather humorless atheist, I think. And then what happened? I think when I was around 20, I got involved with a Buddhist group, which I was approaching from a very psychological perspective. And that was my first year at university. And that was quite interesting. I was obviously quite into my psychedelics by that point anyway, but there wasn't really a spiritual aspect to it for me. And so the Buddhism was really interesting. I found it as a kind of philosophy of mind really fascinating and also very useful in terms of getting the chaos in my head under control. I found that I detested meditating, actually. I really didn't like it at all, but it was quite clear that it made just daily life a whole lot easier. And then what happened was a friend of mine, basically I had blue hair, and the only other guy on my course at uni with blue hair and I became friends. And he taught me sigil magic, or he mentioned sigil magic to me, and I kind of laughed in his face. And he laughed back at me and said, well, give it a go. So I did, and that was a bit of a surprise when that worked. I can't remember what I encanted for. And that kind of worked a few more times. And from there on in, it just kind of got rapidly weirder and weirder. I guess I've always been pretty skeptical of everything, and I got skeptical of enough to be skeptical of my, I guess, uninformed skepticism. And now I'm not really sure where I'm at now. You know, my spiritual practice, I guess, is Santo Daime, and in there, one of the very wise things that the founder of Santo Daime did, Mestre Nemo, was he took the creed out of the Catholic litany. So we're not really obliged to believe anything, and that's kind of really attracts me. I believe that things happen when you do things, as a great magician once said. I'm paraphrasing.
Yeah, it reminds me of what Jung said. The unconscious isn't going to come and help you out. You actually have to search it. And yes, a lot of things open up. And it's interesting, as many of the listeners know, I have was part of the Santo Daime Church in Lisbon, Portugal, Cascais. I haven't been back in a while, but I was pretty active, and Santo Daime really helped me. It's fascinating, opened up a lot of vistas, and of course brought a lot of challenges, which brought a lot of opportunities. So maybe you can give the audience a little bit about the history of Santo Daime.
So it goes back to a very tall black man by the name of Raimundo Irineu Serra, and he was from the northeast east side of Brazil, the side of Brazil which is closer to Africa than it is to where he traveled to, which was present-day Acre. So he went there to seek his fortune with the rubber boom, which was supplying the rubber for the wars that we were pursuing in Europe. And so when he was there, he encountered probably Hunikuin Indians. We're not entirely sure which particular indigenous group he encountered, and they taught him how to use ayahuasca. And he began in a kind of quite traditional manner, although he was about twice as tall as anybody else in the area. So right from the beginning, he kind of stood out in every sense of the word. He was also a very, very black man in a very traditional and very conservative part of Brazil, where kind of the indigenous people were considered devils of the forest at the time. And this tall black man began practicing as a curandero and gained some a degree of respect because he was a very good curandero. In fact, some of his political enemies who later sought to shut down the early incarnation of Santo Daime, or Daime, actually. We call it Daime. Santo Daime is a later name, which was given to it. But so he cured some of his enemies, some of his most intractable enemies from quite serious diseases. So he began doing his work as a curandero and slowly gathered around him a group of followers, mostly black people. There were some other incarnations. There was the Centro de Regeneração de Fé as well, which was another group he was involved with. He kind of introduced ayahuasca into something of a spiritist group, and that was all going quite well until the authorities in the capital heard about this, and they said, you've got to get rid of that ayahuasca stuff. And he said, well, I am this stuff, and if this goes, so do I. So off he went. And so he started doing his works. Well, actually, before that, he got a vision. He had a vision of the moon. The moon came down to him one day and said, you're going to stop this business of whistling and doing icaros, which is a traditional indigenous way of passing on the power of a plant to someone who is in need of cure, or it could be the power of the water or the rain or something like that, but some kind of natural power. And the moon said to him, what you're going to do is you're going to sing. And he said, I can't sing. And the moon said to him, yes, you can. I'm telling you to sing. And she basically forced him to open his mouth, gave him a command, which Brazilian mums give to their children. She said something along the lines of, it's me that's ordering you, or aren't I ordering you? So she said, open your mouth and sing, and he sang a song which became the first hymn of 132 songs which he produced throughout his life. And he had a place in an encampment in a place called Villa Ivonete, which was he was doing his sessions, and the police came and surrounded it with guns and with orders to shut it down. And Mestre Irineu, as he became known as, he came out and they said, are you going to shut this down? He said, no, I'm not. So they arrested him and he went off to be interrogated. And during the interrogation, he managed to persuade them that not only was he not doing the work of the devil, which was why they went to go and shut him down, but that he was doing good work. So they gave him a patch of land in what is now Rio Branco. And then he set his followers so he resettled there and his followers started farming. And then there was this sneaky English guy who went and stole rubber seed from the area and brought it back to just up the road from where I live here, Chelsea Physic Garden, and propagated it, and the whole rubber boom collapsed and lots of people were starving in that particular region. So the city swelled, Rio Branco swelled, and he was producing about 40% of the agricultural produce at the time. So he became something of a local hero. And there's a bairro, a district named after him, and you can catch a bus on the way to, on the front of the bus, it says Irineu Serra, which was his name. So, and it grew and it grew and it grew and became kind of more formalized in many ways. We wear an outfit. The men stand on one side, the women stand on the other. In fact, we don't stand, we dance. There's a kind of, as you'll know, a two-step this way and a two-step that way, modeled on the waves of the sea. And it became, I encountered it first in Japan because it ended up there, and I was drinking for about 5 years in Japan, and then I decided I was going to go and check it out at its source. So I came back to England for a bit, and off I went to the Brazilian Amazon. And not long after I'd been there, I got bitten by a sandfly, and I was actually cutting ayahuasca vine at the time, and it kind of swelled into a pimple, this bite, and the pimple became a boil, and the boil turned out to be something called leishmaniosa in Portuguese, which is leishmaniasis in English, and it's quite a serious leprous infection or colony that eats into your flesh. And so my history of it up until that point had been very blessed, really. I'd seen all kinds of magics over and over again, just things that would astound me, things that would fall into my hands when I asked for them. And then I got quite a serious test in the form of this disease. And the disease, the second stage of it, attacks the cartilage in your nose and the cartilage in your ears and your stomach and stuff. And it's nasty, really nasty. It kind of grows and it just keeps on growing, really. So what happened to me then? I was at the time I was writing a book, and a lot of it was about the history of medicine and authority and autonomy over your body. And I just didn't really buy the story that I had to take injections for it. I was told I had to take injections of antimony and tartrate, which is a heavy metal. And to cut a long story short, I just, I drank a dose, actually. The advice there was very clear. You can get rid of this disease, but it will come back like it's come back for all the other people who you've seen. So I treated it with about 8 months. I was sick for 8 months, doing a cura there. Doing a kind of cure under the tutelage of a kind of master daimista, and drinking every day for about 4 months of it. And so I learnt a great deal during that time. I lost 10 kilos. I lost some rose-coloured spectacles on the world. I lost my ex-wife. I lost a whole load of things, but I gained a little bit of insight into the mystery of fleshy incarnation. And death, life, all kinds of things. So Daime is, as you say, very, very challenging, and it can the challenges make you stronger.
Oh, agreed. I'm glad you're still with us in the flesh. I think what I want to ask you next is, when I did Santo Daime, I had no idea what it was. I just sort of went back to Portugal, and my uncle was opening this church, and I was like, okay, let's do it. Drank this horrible tasting tea. And then started doing what I thought was very corny Christian songs. And like you meant, that, two-step dance, and oh my God. And I was like, well, I'll just do it. Why not? And then the Daime kicks in and the visions kick in. And like you said, it's challenging your ego. You face all your horrors, all your insecurities, all your fears. And then there's sort of a release, and, you're going through this, and everybody's doing their corny dance, and women on one side, men on the other. And it's an amazing experience. And I've done ayahuasca in other groups, and it's never been as good as with Santo Daime for me. And I always go back to, it's got to be those corny Christian songs that Mestre Zé did. What do you think? What about the songs that really make a difference? Or Santo Daime, have you been able to decipher this, Danny?
Oh, no, I guess I'm still working on that. I came to it with probably even less information than you. I was in Japan, and my girlfriend at the time didn't speak a whole lot of English, and she said, "Do you want to come to a crazy drugs party?" And I went, "Yeah, of course I do."
Sure.
She couldn't explain a whole lot more than that, and I wasn't really, I was sold already. So off I went, and gentlemen on one side in blue trousers and white shirts and wearing stars, and ladies on the other. And I guess the music I found the music quite beautiful right from the beginning. There were lots of instrumentation where I was, including kind of Japanese flutes and all sorts going on. But I found the prayer very challenging. I felt very Jewish indeed, actually, in my first experience. So I kind of stood contemptuous while all that was going on. But like you say, the Daime kicks in. So, what is it that's so special about it? I think, I didn't understand the Portuguese at the time. but there's something about. I mean, we did sessions when it first got banned in England. We did a session which was just with water. So we got the whole crew together, and set up the whole place, got into our outfits, got some buckets out even, and just drank water and did a session. And the whole, just basically going side to side and everybody singing in unison and dancing in unison has a great deal of power just on its own. And then you mix a little bit of, or rather a lot of ayahuasca into it as well. And yeah, it really levels up. I guess one of the many wise things that Mestre Ireneo did was he said one day, I'm not going to play maraca anymore on my own. He said, we're all going to play maraca. We're all going to play the percussion instrument. And part of it is that every step you take, you're beating a maraca, we say in English, a maraca, into the hand. And so you basically have to stay focused. At least one part of you has to stay with the group. And if you're a split second out, you can hear it straight away because your maraca goes out. So part of it demands constant attention to where you are. And one of the things with ayahuasca, I'm not familiar with other kind of neo-shamanic or shamanic forms very much, except from an academic perspective. But it seems that you can go very, very deep and very, very far into your vision, which is fantastic. You can do that with Santo Daime as well. But some part of you is also keyed into the geometry of the room because, in my lineage, it's set up in a square, and so you're moving in time and in space and in rhythm, and you've also got these teachings, these as you put it, these corny songs, which are actually, some of them are extremely profound. There's one called Tabernacle, for example. It doesn't mention a white lion anywhere in the song, but it's very much about alchemy. There's another one, Flor de Aguas, you'll probably be familiar with. Right. But the teachings of Mestre Ireneo are actually quite seriously profound once you get beyond the, repulsion of the Jesus and the Virgin Mary and Saint Joseph might engender in someone who's got a bit of a history with and against Christianity.
Yeah, at the time I didn't have a problem with the Christianity. I just thought, what is this really about? And it really took me far. And it was always interesting because I'd ask people in the church, well, would you ever do ayahuasca by itself? And they were like, no, it's a very bad trip. That's what I thought at first what ayahuasca was, like a terrible bad LSD trip. But as my uncle, for example, he will do ayahuasca even before he goes on a bike ride or something. He's already trained his body and his mind to do it. I would never do it only during a ritual. And I know in churches in Brazil, they'll have these big services on Sunday. Hundreds of people will show up, and even the kids will do the Santo Daime, the most powerful narcotic in the world, as they say. So it's very fascinating how this works out, don't you think?
Well, yeah, my experience of in Brazil is those kids have grown up with it, and they're the ones who don't throw up, and they're the ones who are absolutely fine. I've taught these guys, and I'll say, like, how was your session? Oh, it was fine. Yeah, of course it was fine. Oh, yeah. Oh, well, that's interesting because I threw up 3 times, and they'll kind of laugh at me, going, "Ha, look at you throwing up."
I remember throwing up too.
Yeah, it's it's very much part of it's their medicine. They'll take it for a cold. People will take it if they're, trying to overcome depression or alcoholism or something. They'll take a little dose in the morning, a spoonful. The children there, they get very small doses, but yeah, even in the baptism, it's part of the baptism. So it kind of, it raises a lot of objections in the West, this idea of feeding psychedelics to children. But the research is all very, very clear. The Brazilian government put together a panel of experts from all kinds of different medical and sociological disciplines to study it because Daime got banned in Brazil for a time, and the sociologists and the pharmacologists and all that went in, and their comment was, well, on the sociological level, that it provides cohesion to the group, that the people are they respect they're law abiding and they looking what do you call the degree of order? I'm forgetting exactly what the conclusions were, but they are very orderly and law abiding people. The things that the rest of Brazilian society looks up to. And in terms of, there was a question over whether pregnant women should be able to take it, for example, and that was kind of put on hold. And then they did a bunch of tests on pregnant women, and lo and behold, it's absolutely fine for pregnant women. So we tend to expect drugs to make us feel really good and then make us feel really bad the next day. But ayahuasca, or certainly if you're Daime, or ayahuasca, if it's taken in a careful and respectful way, it kind of does the opposite. It can quite often make you feel bad and then make you feel overfelt. And sometimes that you never really come down off it in a way because something quite fundamental can change.
And I'm sure you would agree with me on this when people ask me about Daime or ayahuasca. I tell them, make sure you find a shaman or a leader that can guide you. This person is basically a doctor and a therapist. Never go at it alone. And as you mentioned, go at it with a lot of humility and respect for the spiritual world and the world itself.
I think that's probably a good idea. I guess the main thing is, do you trust the person in charge enough to, if you had a newborn baby, would you put the newborn baby in his or her hands for the entire night and pick it up in the morning? Because that's basically what you're doing with your psychology, with your soul, with your central nervous system. So if you trust the person, and if your trust is well placed, then yeah, sure, go ahead. You'll have a marvelous time. But if not, well, you might be in trouble. But, sometimes people need to fall in the mud and eat some mud to learn that they need to walk a bit more carefully, Even in, I absolutely wouldn't recommend anyone who didn't know what they were doing to take it on their own. I wouldn't dream of doing something like that. And there's a lot of dodgy people about, psychedelics have a wonderful power of dissolving boundaries. And one of the things that they do often is they promote ego expansion, a very ugly ego expansion. So people will go off to the jungle, they'll maybe drink 3 or 4 times, and they'll come back to Europe, and they'll announce that they're a shaman, and they'll be throwing ceremonies and get involved in all kinds of indiscretions. And in Daime we have some very strict rules about, for example, you can't invite people, you can't proselytize, you can't lean on people or oblige people to go. There's quite a lot of, you can't do propaganda. We say you can't run out of a session and say, oh, it's amazing, it's fantastic, you got to go. All that kind of stuff is just banned outright, because that kind of messianic urge that people get when they decide that this is the thing, or they are the one, or all that kind of stuff. It's ugly and quite dangerous. So yeah, make sure you know what you're doing. Make sure someone knows what they're doing.
Agreed. In fact, yeah, when I was in the church, there were some people who really thought they were Jesus Christ. You could tell they were already being transformed in the wrong kind of way. So, like Aldous Huxley said, an idiot doing acid is still just an idiot on acid. So, the change has to be beyond the drug.
Indeed. There was a comment on that dude who ran into the fire at Burning Man just recently. Acid is not going to stop. Yeah, absolutely. Just like what Huxley said, dear.
Yeah, excellent.
Terrible.
And Irenaeus, the good Irenaeus, not the Irenaeus we blast here in the show. He found ayahuasca, but that was already being used with indigenous people at the time. It goes farther back, doesn't it?
Indigenous, also mestizo. There's a whole rubber tapper tradition in that area, because that was the medicine. People got ill, they had a choice. They'd either go to the indigenous people or they'd go to the rubber tappers who knew what they're doing with ayahuasca. So yeah, all over. It's a very complex scene, both in Peru and Ecuador. You've got certain tribes, indigenous tribes, which were introduced to ayahuasca via mestizo people, for example. You've got, I remember I moved to Minas Gerais, and I was at a center there in Minas Gerais, which is outside the Amazon in the middle of Brazil. And there were a couple of indigenous people from the Patoxó group who had drunk ayahuasca for the first time with this lineage, which was formed by a black man who went into the jungle and brought it out, and was then the ceremony itself was run by a white man, and there was a pair of indigenous people who then kind of got into ayahuasca through that way. And yeah, there's plenty of indigenous tribes who've learnt ayahuasca of people who aren't indigenous, people who are mestizo, for example. So yeah, this idea of the authentic ayahuasca lineage, or the authentic anything, actually is a little bit problematic. People can be authentic in their approach, but if you're tracing back into history, it becomes very, very dark and very, very complex.
Like everything else, it's always a little bit messy and a little bit dangerous, but that's why we take the risks. But moving on to your book, Danny, Neuro-Apocalypse, it's a spanning book that covers so much. And I'd like to talk a little bit about your chapter, Exo Drugs. Tell the audience about that, which basically goes to the idea of how the ancients were using psychedelics, specifically the Israelites.
Right. Okay. So the book, about a year actually, it segues quite nicely, because about a year after I started drinking Daime in Japan, my insomnia turned into something quite different. It turned into nighttime compulsive writing, and then I wrote like massive scrawls on a whole bunch of bits of paper that went into envelopes, and someone helped me organize them a number of years later, and they got organized into a trilogy, two of which have been published, and the third of which is yet to be published. And so the second book that I've written is called Neuro-Apocalypse. The first one, Science Revealed, and that one has this chapter, Exo Drugs. And what I'm looking at there is preparations mostly from Exodus of psychoactive compounds, and most of them. I mean, the lineage actually goes back at least as far as Egypt. So one of the interesting preparations is called the Shemen HaMishcha. It's in Mishcha. It means anointing oil, right? And that word Mishcha comes from Mashah, and that means to wipe or to paint. It's where we get the word massage from. And it seems like it was a massage oil, and it certainly was in. There was a very similar preparation made by the Egyptian apothecaries for Pharaoh, and that was certainly a massage oil. So you have this stuff, and it's got a really, really interesting mix of ingredients, and it's got 4 ingredients. I mean, it's quite interesting that there are drugs in the Bible, but the fact that the drugs are combined with such astute technologies is, I think, for me, more interesting. So you've got 4 ingredients in there. One of them is myrrh, one of them is cinnamon, one of them is cassia, and one of them is something which is called in Hebrew kaneh bossam. We'll come back to that in a minute. But all the other 3, and in fact, kaneh bossam as well, it works on the kind of allobenzene chemistry. So myrrh works on the opioid system, works on mu and delta opioid receptors. So it's classed as a tranquilizer. It's also classed as an aphrodisiac. You can put it, actually, if you put a couple of drops of the tincture under your tongue, you will know quite soon what the effect of it is. And then you've got cinnamon and you've got cassia, and cinnamon contains eugenol, and eugenol is what you make MDMA out of. And cassia contains estradiol, and estradiol, if you inject it, for example, it has it's described as an electric LSD-like effect. It's very, very powerful psychoactive. But the reason that eating cinnamon or eating cassia, which is Chinese cinnamon, it's a relative cinnamon, the reason that eating them on their own won't do anything for you is because you have enzymes in your body which break down those allobenzene. So it's a little bit like ayahuasca, in fact. If you have a spoonful of DMT, it won't do a whole lot for you. But if you've inhibited your monoamine oxidase enzymes with harmine and harmaline before you have a spoonful of DMT, then it will do all sorts for you. So we're looking at enzyme inhibition here, and so you've got cassia, myrrh, and cinnamon, and all of those 3 work on the cytochrome system, which is an enzyme system which inhibits or breaks down allobenzenes. So, kind of simply put, this combination, it does something very similar to what nutmeg does. I don't know if you're familiar with nutmeg, but that packs quite a punch, and if you get your dose right, it can be absolutely fantastic and mind-blowing stuff, kind of like an MDMA trip. Nutmeg, but obviously nutmeg came from the middle of nowhere. It came from the Band Islands in the middle of the sea, and the Israelites didn't have access to it. But the reason that nutmeg is so powerful is that it contains both these psychoactive allobenzenes and also enzymes which inhibit, enzyme inhibitors. So the allobenzenes can get to your brain. So the Israelites seem to have got round this. In fact, the Egyptians who got there first by combining very cleverly these compounds into a mixture which contained both the enzymes, the enzyme inhibitors, and the psychoactives. So there's quite an interesting another a book. It's the Kalachakra Tantra. It's one of the Indian texts, and it describes the union of nutmeg and myrrh. Union of nutmeg and myrrh, and I forget the exact quote, but it talks about how the union of these things turns on the light of knowledge, or something along these lines. And one brave tantrika decided to combine these two things, and his description of what happened was very much similar to what you might expect if you were to meet Yahweh. He describes a fierce and aggressive deity, describes this kind of man in ceremonial armor. He describes a mental fireball and all this kind of ferocity, and also apocalyptic in the sense of wall penetrating or veil. I didn't know it was producing something that was chemically very similar to the anointing oil. This was a powerful war god, and that's very much what Yahweh is. So this stuff was put upon priests in order that they could minister unto Yahweh, and it was put upon kings in order that they could. I mean, there's this line where Samuel puts the stuff on David, and Yahweh came upon him. The spirit of Yahweh came upon him from that day forward. So it's very specifically used to introduce people to Yahweh. The fourth ingredient is Kaneh Bossum. In the singular, that's Kaneh Boss, and it seems very, very likely that that's cannabis, because every single tribe around Palestine has certainly textual evidence, and in many cases archaeological evidence of using cannabis. And the Scythians called it cannabis. The Persians called it something very similar. The Babylonians called it something similar. The Greeks called it something similar. And even the Egyptians, it was found on the tomb of Ramesses II, or rather on the mummy of Ramesses II. And it would have had to come through Palestine because that was the trade route. So we know that there was a trade in cannabis at the time. We know that Kaneh Bossum was sold, there's descriptions of it being sold in the Bible, in the marketplace, and it coming from a long, long way away. So these four things are combined into this wonderful, into this anointing oil, and this is what the priests put upon them. And then the high priest would go, I mean, there's a massive story, I could talk about this all day, but the high priest would go into the back of the tabernacle, into a 4.5 meter cubed chamber, which with four materials, 2 skins and 2 other materials, pulled tightly over a frame at the back and a thick veil. And the only thing that happens in that chamber is the burning of amounts, like handfuls of finely ground incense, and talking to angels and seeing visions. And the incense contains something like 11 or 12 psychoactive compounds, mostly working on kind of GABA system, opioid system. Some of them are boosting dopamine or serotonin. It's really quite a complex mixture, bunch of mixtures and a bunch of techniques. The tabernacle is interesting. Tabernacle is described in immaculate detail in the Bible. Nothing else gets anything like that much detail. And it's this, how far apart the hooks were and what everything was made of. And that was the form of inhaling stuff before the pipe was introduced to the Middle East, was basically folding down the flaps of your tent, throwing it on the fire, and then just sitting in the vapors and enjoying yourself.
Yeah, it looks like they had their own sort of Santo Daime ritual, but I guess this thing is universal across all religions and faith. And yes, it's obvious that the Israelites definitely embraced this ecstatic religion where they summoned the spirit of Yahweh. And some believe that Christianity was started very much like also a spirit possession movement, but the spirit of Yahweh just turned into the spirit of Jesus, sort of a hypostasis. But not leaving too far from the Old Testament, tell the audience about the idea of the manna from heaven that was so essential for the survival of the Israelites in the story of Exodus.
Right. Okay. It's a very interesting story. So the manna, we tend to think of manna from heaven as dropping like sacks of food aid or something. Man is a secretion, as it's described. In fact, the word man describes a secretion that the Bedouins pick up in the Bedouin language. It's kind of like a sugary substance that comes out the bottoms of aphids. and then ants harvest it, and if the ants don't get there first, Bedouins harvest it, and it's something they eat. That's called man in Bedouin language. So manna, when the Israelites encounter it, they say manhu, which is interpreted as what is this. Doesn't actually mean what is this, because that's mahu in Hebrew, manhu, and the rabbis argue about why they use this word, which is what, to mean what, and it can also mean is this manna, is this man, as in Bedouin man. And Moses says he doesn't agree. He says this is the bread which the Lord gives you, something along those lines, right? So what is it? It's found in pellets, in white shiny pellets the size of coriander, and it's also found as a hoarfrost on the ground, which is a very, very thin. Hoarfrost is what gets left over when the dew freezes in the morning, so it's a very, very thin kind of carpet of stuff. So immediately there you can see how it might relate to a secretion, because the secretion comes out of a plant and leaves, if it dries on the plant, it leaves little pellets, and if it drops on the ground, it would spread into a kind of like a hoarfrost. And it's also described as you need to prepare it, right? You need to boil it and grind it. Sorry, you need to grind it and then boil it and then bake it. So it has a 3-stage preparation. So you think Yahweh, if he's omnipotent, by the way, as you'll be well aware, Yahweh is not omnipotent, not described as anything like that in the Old Testament. But the question does arise, why doesn't he give them a ready-made meal? You know, why do they got to prepare it? There's quite a lot of evidence, circumstantial evidence that it's an ergot secretion, because firstly, because it looks like it, that's what ergot does. It forms pellets and it forms a hoarfrost. Secondly, because the time of year when they find it is the time of year when ergot comes out of its dormancy. And also they find there's 3 wildernesses, and they don't find it in the first one. They don't find water and they don't find manna in the first one. They find both water and manna in the second one. And obviously ergot requires vegetation, and vegetation requires water. So there's those reasons. And also in order to prepare basically LSA, which is a close cousin of LSD, from ergot's poisonous if you're not careful. You need to boil it and separate off the soluble bit, which is the poisonous bit, and then you bake it, which makes crystals, or you crush it and then you boil it and you bake it, which is actually the description described. And Hoffman, who was the first guy who isolated LSD from ergot, or rather produced LSD from ergot, he said that the making this stuff would be well within the means of early man. And there's a couple of other reasons why I think it's ergot. One of them is that Moses says, make sure you just take what you need for today and don't take any for tomorrow. And those of them who did take some for tomorrow found in the morning that it stank and it bred worms. And ergot, in the first stage of infection, it produces a honeydew, which matches up the description in Exodus. It's described as having the taste of honey and wafers, which it does. But in the second stage of infection, which is very, very shortly afterwards, it starts to stink, which also matches the description in Exodus. And there's another thing, which is really interesting. In the Old Testament, there's only one example of a collective vision in where everyone sees something together. Prophets tend to see or hear angels on their own, but at the foot of Mount Sinai, everyone sees something together. And not only do they see it, but they hear it. So the line goes like this. It goes, and the people are seeing the voices and the flames and the sound of the trumpet. Now, generally, you don't see voices and you don't see the sound of the trumpet, but you can do if you've taken a big dose of acid. So it's the only example of a collective vision, and it's the only example of synesthesia, the mixing of senses, in the whole of the Old Testament. And this happens when the people are taking manna, right? Another thing is that manna is not the only thing that is given to the Israelites in the wilderness. They're given manna, and they're also given quails. Quails fall to the ground in order that they can be picked up, right? So the line goes something along the lines of, in the evening you shall eat meat, and in the morning you should be satisfied with manna. And And it doesn't describe the falling of quails to the ground as a miracle, although that sounds pretty miraculous, right? All of the attention is given to the manna. And it's also the manna which satisfies. It's not the quail meat which satisfies, it's the manna which satisfies, which raises the suggestion that it satisfies in a way that normal meat doesn't. So, I mean, as I read the story, the miracle is not where it comes from, but where it takes you. And that thing. I just want to come back to one thing you said, actually. It's quite interesting, the idea of ecstatic religion amongst the Hebrews. Because the anointing oil, was limited only to the priestly caste, and also the kind of the Ketoret HaSamim, the incense with all the psychoactives in it, was limited just to the high priest himself. Right, so these things were kept inside the tabernacle, and the only time that the Israelites get their hands on any of the good stuff is in this story of Exodus, when manna is being collected by them. And towards the end of the story of Exodus, there's a really, really interesting line. There's a pair of lines where basically Moses says, here, get some of that manna and keep it for the generations so they can see what sustained us in the wilderness, right? That's his first line. And then the very next line says, here, grab that manna and stick it in the testimony, stick it in the tabernacle by the Ark of the Covenant. Which raises a couple of questions. Firstly, it raises the question, why does he give the command twice? Secondly, it raises the question, the first command is for the generations, for everyone to see it. And the second command is put it in the place where no one can see it at all. And the third question it raises, which is the most curious one, is at that point in the story, the tabernacle hasn't been built. It hasn't even been discussed. It's the first mention of the tabernacle. So why does he say, go and stick this in the tabernacle when the tabernacle doesn't exist? And textual scholars interrogate this question and have decided that the second line is what you call an interpolation. So it's a later bit of text which was added to one of the earlier documents that made up the Bible. I don't know if your readers are familiar with documentary hypothesis and contextual criticism on the Bible, but it was put together from a whole bunch of different documents, and it seems that the document where it says here, let everyone have the manna, came from a very different political milieu and a very different structure to the document which said, here, make sure no one gets the manna, make sure we keep it with the priestly caste, because all the good stuff ends with the priestly caste. Which is kind of interesting, because when something very similar appeared in the 1960s, once again, it all ended up with, the CIA were allowed to do experiments, but all the research on acid was stopped, because it's very clear that having access to cheap and safe psychedelic, which dissolves the walls that we put up between us, is very threatening to the powers that be.
Agreed. Very much.
So Christos, I mean, coming just one more thing I want to say, coming forward into the Christian time, the Christos also means anointed. It's the same word as Mashiach, which is Messiah. So the anointing that Christ was done, he broke the taboo of only allowing priests to be anointed, and he anoints his followers, and he says to his followers, go and anoint the sick. So he was all for letting everyone be anointed, and that was kind of, again, bad news for the authorities.
Agreed. Do you have any evidence of when this sort of entheogen use might have been banned in Judaism? Do you think it was the reformations of King Josiah around there, or something else?
That is a really good question. I think in basically 10th century BC, when what's called the Yahwist was written, no, I don't think it was a problem. I think, yeah, probably. I wouldn't be surprised if it was Josiah or Hezekiah, one of the two, because they were the ones who smashed all the shrines and clamped down on, we could say pagan, but basically local religion and local autonomy, and they centralized the entire cult around Jerusalem. So, yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if that's when it happened.
Indeed, and going back a little bit in time, you mentioned the Egyptian influence with the psychedelics and how it survived with the Israelites. I think you mentioned that the Levites certainly borrowed, or they were the ones who kept the Egyptian tradition alive with the Israelites. But what about the Zoroastrian influence? I mean, we do know that the Zoroastrians were also doing entheogens, right?
Yeah, so there seems to be something called Halma, or Homa. Halma, I think it's pronounced. Seems to be linguistically related to Soma. The Zoroastrian influence on Judaism comes much later. It's during the Babylonian exile. Book of Job kind of has the first introduction of some kind of Babylonian concepts, but they're rejected. Like, for example, the really, really bad God and the really, really good God of Zoroastrianism. It doesn't really match up with what happens in Job, because Satan is given license to torment Job in that particular book. And then by the time you get to Daniel, you've got a whole lot of angelic influences. You've got these hierarchies of angels and all that kind of stuff coming in. But we're already talking about kind of 2nd century BC by then. So the Zoroastrian influence is pretty slow as it develops in Judaism, but they end up with, you know, all the kind of familiar Christian tropes and even kind of late Jewish tropes of, you know, the resurrection of everybody and this kind of final Armageddon, you know, inverted commas, apocalypse, the end of the world, and all that kind of jazz. Which none of that's in the 5 books of Moses. There's no end. There's no world in the 5 books of Moses. There's the land, but they don't have this kind of concept of everything. It really comes with the Zoroastrian Empire, with the Persian Empire, really, and that massive expanse, which was the first time that an empire united different languages and different cults and all that kind of thing. And it's a kind of a megalomaniac system, really, and it requires a megalomaniac god, an omnipotent deity. So even the nature of God changes, and then Satan changes as well. So by the time of Revelations, you've got Satan, you know, they kind of wrap together the snake and the dragon and the lie, and who deceiveth the whole world and that kind of thing. But that's a very, very far cry from what Satan and what the snake are about in the earlier books of the Bible.
Yes, fascinating stuff, and perfect timing too. Like the Gnostics, you and your book are very fascinated with the story of Genesis, looking for insights. So tell the listener about, you have a short chapter on Genesis and the Serpent. Tell us your insights on that, and we can have a discussion on Genesis.
Ooh, Genesis. I mean, that's a lovely book.
Yeah.
It's a great book. So it's kind of reproduced a little bit in the Testimony of Truth, but the Hebrew side of that story. So you got this line, right? Genesis 2, the last verse of Genesis 2, and they were both naked, the man and his wife, and were not ashamed. And then the next line, basically, the first verse of Genesis 3 says, "Now the serpent was more subtle than any beast of the field which Yahweh Elohim had made." And that line there raises quite a lot of questions. It raises, well, for one thing, Hebrew is a very, very fluid language. So it's not clear in that line whether Yahweh Elohim made the serpent or not, or whether he was there already. But another thing is that the pronunciation of Hebrew is in the voweling, as in how is in how you decide to vowel it, and the vowels are not written in the original text, and the vowels were put into the text in about the 7th century AD. So you had thousands of years of a very, very of the consonants, but not the vowels. And just like the way hat and hit and hut and hot all mean something different, though they contain the same consonants, when you change the vowels or you change the pronunciation of a word, it changes the meaning. So that word subtle, we tend to think of the snake, him being subtle, and that being sly and sneaky. And in fact, that's the only adjective that the snake gets in the entire Bible. Subtle is the word arum in Hebrew. And in the previous line, and they are both naked, the man and his wife, the word naked there, which describes the innocence of the man and his wife, is arom. So it's arum and an arom, and the Hebrew lettering is exactly the same. It's the same word. the pronunciation is set later. But that's kind of mind-blowing, the fact that naked and subtle is the same word. And then when they eat the fruit, there's another kind of interesting line there, because in one pronunciation of it, when Yahweh Elohim says to Eve, why do you eat the fruit? She says, because the snake beguiled me and I ate. But if you pronounce it a different way, it says, the snake elevated me and I ate. So then he goes to Adam. He says, why did you hide? And Adam answers, in the King James Version, I hid because I was naked. But that word naked is also arum, or arum, depending on how you pronounce it. So it could be I hid because I was subtle, I hid because I was naked, and it also means prudent, which kind of makes the most sense. I hid because I was prudent, right? If you look in Proverbs, for example, that word arum and arom, it appears, I think it's 8 times. And every time it appears, it's a virtue. It's never a vice. It's never a bad thing. So, for example, one line goes, the prudent, arom, the prudent are crowned with knowledge. The prudent are crowned with knowledge. You think about the snake is on the tree of knowledge, right? A prudent man foreseeth the evil and hideth himself, right? A prudent man, that's exactly what Adam does in the story of Genesis. He sees the evil coming and he hides. And then Yahweh Elohim says, why do you hide? He said, well, I hid because I was prudent, just like it says in the Proverbs. It all raises a whole load of questions, and this question of evil is kind of fascinating, really, because the tree is the knowledge of good and evil. So what is this about good and evil? The serpent says unto the woman, you shall surely not die, for Elohim doth know that in the day that ye eat thereof, then your eyes shall be opened, and ye shall be as gods, knowing good and evil. Now, one thing that's really interesting in that line is that it could be translated as, and you shall be as gods, but knowing good and evil, i.e., you could be as gods, but unlike the gods, in that you'd know good and evil, whereas they don't. Hebrew is extremely flexible, and that's kind of the point of it, really. The Bible is said to have 70 faces for every interpretation of every verse. It's traditionally said to be 70 different ways of interpreting a verse. And the way Christians and kind of rather closed-minded Christians are looking for what the Bible actually means. It means a multiplicity of things all at the same time. That's the beauty of it. So who's good and who's evil in that story? Well, the snake tells the truth. The snake says your eyes shall be opened, and their eyes are opened. And Yahweh Elohim says, in that day that you eat, you shall surely die. And they don't die. They don't die in that day. So who's telling the truth? The snake is telling the truth, and Yahweh Elohim is lying. Now, the word evil, that's another very interesting word, ra in Hebrew, right? We tend to think of evil as kind of serial killers and things like that. In the Bible, some figs that have gone rotten are described as ra. It says in the King James Version, it's quite funny, it describes them as very naughty figs, right? But then it means rotten. So ra doesn't necessarily, it can mean bad, but it can also mean rotten, something that's beyond its sell-by date or something like that. And who's described as evil in the Bible? It's not the snake, but it is Yahweh. So there's a time when Yahweh decides that he's going to annihilate the Israelites because they have worshipped the golden calf, and he says, I'm going to go and annihilate them. And Moses says, this be far from thee to do. He says, think about the old days, don't do it, this isn't the right thing to do. And so the text goes, and Yahweh repented of the evil which he sought to do. And that's not the only place where he's described as performing or about to perform evil, right? So we get this idea, and it's kind of imported from Zoroastrianism much, much later, that Yahweh is the good guy, God is the good guy. All the gods are kind of this one mega god, omnipotent, omnipresent, all that palaver. But the gods are at odds with each other, and they're at odds with man as well. So I'll give you another example. El Shaddai says to Abraham, go and sacrifice your son. And Abraham says, okay, and off he goes. He goes up the mountain. And then the angel of Yahweh appears to Abraham and says, don't sacrifice your son, right? So he gets conflicting advice from different gods. And Abraham has to make the choice of which one he's going to follow. And obviously he follows Yahweh, and Isaac survives. So I think, I mean, that's the kind of crux of it. The for me anyway, the gods. If we talk about Elohim, right? Elohim it means power, basically. El is power. Elim is power in the plural, so it's power or powers, and then the He is a letter of femininity. So it's a complicated word which is both masculine, feminine, plural, and singular and abstract. And I tend to think of it as the mains, the electricity, you know, and then you can plug in a toaster, you can plug in a computer, you can plug in an electric chair, you can plug in a drill, and whatever you plug in is what the other god names are. So Elohim never appears in the Bible after the first kind of 6 days of creation. He's there, and occasionally his name is called on in the 5 books of Moses, but he never sets foot in the garden. He never kind of does anything in the world. Yahweh Elohim sets foot in the garden, and he's a totally different character. You know, he gets jealous and he gets angry and he tells lies and punishes and curses and all that kind of business. And then El Shaddai is completely different again. They're all completely different, behaving in completely different ways. And then there's the snake. You know, he's described as the enemy. Nachash is his name. And but he's not the enemy of God, or he's not the enemy of Yahweh. It's Yahweh who gives him license to torment Job. He's the enemy of Job, but he's not the enemy of Yahweh. So it's all very, 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 very complex. And it's as complex as Hebrew language, which is obviously different to the Indo-European languages. In the Indo-European languages, something either is or it isn't, and it can't be both. This is the laws of thought of Aristotle, and they're based on Indo-European grammar, basically. But in Hebrew, something very much can be one thing and the other. It can be subtle, and it can be naked, and it can be prudent, all at the same time.
Yeah, very complex. It reminds me of how the Gnostics saw the aeons as both places and personifications and aspects of the divine, or even the Mandeans. When they talk about their angelic beings, they're also, again, they're places. It's multidimensional. And I love how you quote the Testimony of Truth, the Valentinian work in the Nag Hammadi library, and even the author in the 2nd century is like, what is your problem, God? You can't see Adam. He's challenging him or describing him as a very limited being, isn't he?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. And he is, you know, he's, the whole idea of being jealous. I mean, why would you be jealous if you were everything? What would you be jealous of? You know?
Really fascinating content you're giving us, Danny. I would urge the audience to get his book, Neuro-Apocalypse, because we really have only touched the surface on so much. And check out Danny's work, which I will have links in the show notes. But I think that's all the time we have today. I'd like to thank you very much for coming on Aeon Vite and giving us a very stimulating discussion.
Yeah, it's absolutely fantastic. I really, really appreciate it. And yeah, thanks so much for your work. One thing I would like to say, actually, if people are interested in getting hold of Neuro-Apocalypse, get it from the publisher, get it from Psychedelic Press, rather than get it from Amazon, because we get about 15p for every book sold from Amazon, because they are the rapists of the publishing world. So go and have a look on there, and we might be less skint. Thanks very much, Miguel. Really, really appreciate it.
Thank you. And there you have it. Or as Greg says in THC, boom goes the dynamite. Or boom went the lit joint. Our first part with Danny Nemu from his book, Neuro-Apocalypse. In our second part, we continue down the entheogen yellow brick road. But the good Reverend also discusses some amazing insights, breaking down the names of the demiurge in the Old Testament and what he does, and then also relating them to the processes of the human mind. And this certainly ties with my introduction, where I talked about the nature of the Creator God. Danny also unveils startling but scholarly truths about Noah and the flood, and some very interesting revelations about ancient archaeology and how they expose truths of the Bible. And so much more, including the problem of scientism and a brief talk about the power of hypnotism, that Western form of meditation. Not to be missed, because Danny really has an eye for things most people miss. Only $5.99 a month to join. Complete and not partial shows. You get access to more than 380 episodes with the best and brightest in Gnosticism, Western esoteric, and free thought. You get your own private RSS feed where you can listen to all complete shows on the podcaster of your choice. Invitation to our Inner Sanctum of Gnosis Facebook group, where we are building a community of mystics, madmen, and sages. Many past guests hang out there, and I'm always there to directly and personally answer your questions and issues, and give you news on the show before it even happens. Same benefits if you become a patron at Patreon, except you get early shows. If anything, if you can, a few shekels here and there via PayPal or the US mail. Let's keep this Red Pill cafeteria open, and let's keep that content coming to get you that high you so much need. Boom goes the joint, or spliff. All manner of help can be found at, you got it, the God above God that can. It's the beginning of the year. It's the end of the world as we know it, and I hope you feel high and fine. I'm glad you're still here. I'm glad we can be free as we stand together and rise divided. Hello and goodbye as always.